Ananya Deshmukh's dream began with a student visa and ended with a blood-stained marriage certificate, and beside her lay Ethan Walker, the man who turned her hope for a new life in Canada into a deadly game of betrayal and revenge. Ananya Deshmukh had always been the kind of girl who dreamed beyond her surroundings. Growing up in Pune, she was raised by her widowed mother, who worked as a schoolteacher and saved every rupee to make sure her daughter could study abroad. Ananya's life had been a story of quiet determination, early mornings, late night study sessions, and a single goal in mind: to build a better life far away from the struggles of home. When she received her acceptance letter from a college in Toronto, it felt like a miracle. Canada represented everything she had worked for: a fresh start, independence, and success. But the dream began to fade almost as soon as she arrived. The Canadian winter was harsh, the city too big, and the loneliness unbearable. Ananya found herself sharing a cramped basement apartment with 3 other international students, each fighting their own battles. The small heater barely worked, the walls were damp, and the rent consumed most of her savings. She balanced classes during the day and a part-time cafe job in the evenings, often returning home past midnight with frozen hands and aching feet. Her scholarship covered tuition, but daily expenses, groceries, transit, bills, slowly pulled her into debt. She watched other students find comfort in relationships or supportive families nearby, but she had neither. Every phone call home was an act of pretending. She told her mother she was doing fine, that she loved her classes, that she ate well. She never mentioned the nights she cried herself to sleep or skipped meals to save bus fare. As months passed, her student visa became a silent threat hanging over her head. She needed to find a way to stay in Canada after graduation, but the legal pathways were long, expensive, and uncertain. Without permanent residency, she'd be sent back to India, her degree unfinished, her sacrifices wasted. One afternoon, while serving coffee at the cafe, she met Ethan Walker. He was a regular customer, a mechanic who worked at a nearby garage. Ethan had an easy smile and a casual charm that immediately drew people in. He seemed genuinely interested in her, asking about her studies, her family, her dreams. For the first time in months, Ananya felt seen. He began visiting more often, waiting for her after shifts, helping her carry groceries. Slowly, he became a constant presence in her life. It wasn't long before Ethan learned about her visa troubles. One evening, in what seemed like an act of kindness, he offered a solution. He told her he could marry her so she could apply for permanent residency. It sounded simple, even romantic. He mentioned that many people did it, marriages of convenience, a quick ceremony, and both parties benefiting. In return, he asked for a small arrangement fee, promising that after 2 years of marriage, she would have her papers and could move on with her life. Ananya hesitated at first. It felt wrong, dishonest. But as her visa deadline approached and rejection letters piled up from companies unwilling to sponsor a foreign student, fear replaced morality. She convinced herself that everyone bent the rules sometimes to survive. Ethan seemed trustworthy, and the way he spoke about helping her sounded sincere. The wedding was a quiet affair held at a small city office in Mississauga. She wore a plain white dress borrowed from her roommate, and Ethan signed the papers with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. There were no family members, no celebration, just 2 signatures that would supposedly change her life. That night, as she stared at the marriage certificate, Ananya told herself it was worth it. She would finally have stability, a chance to stay in the country legally, and time to focus on her future. But it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Ethan began showing a different side, a man who was controlling, impatient, and oddly secretive. He wanted access to her bank account to manage shared expenses, insisted she move into his apartment, and started keeping tabs on her whereabouts. He became possessive and temperamental, accusing her of ungratefulness whenever she questioned him. What had started as an act of survival began to feel like a trap. Within months, she realized the marriage was a scam, but by then it was too late. Her life, her finances, and even her legal status were now in his hands. Canada had promised her a new beginning, but all she had found was a different kind of prison, one made not of walls, but of fear and dependence. and she had no idea that the man who once smiled at her across the cafe counter would soon destroy everything she had built. After the wedding, Ananya moved into Ethan's small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Mississauga. It wasn't what she imagined married life to be. The walls were stained with cigarette smoke, the furniture looked second-hand, and Ethan spent most nights drinking beer in front of the television. Still, she told herself it was temporary. Once her residency paperwork was approved, she would find her own place, continue her studies, and maybe even send money home. But the weeks that followed showed her just how wrong she was. Ethan's behavior changed the moment the marriage certificate arrived. He began acting like he owned her. He told her when to go out, what to wear, and who to talk to. When she questioned him, he reminded her that her visa status depended on him. He said if she didn't cooperate, he could report the marriage as fraudulent and have her deported. The way he said it made her stomach twist. She realized he was no longer her savior, he was her captor. Then came the money. At first, he asked for small amounts, just a few $100s here and there. He claimed it was to pay an immigration consultant who could help speed up her paperwork. Later, he said the officers handling their case expected gifts to look the other way. Ananya, terrified of losing her status, gave him everything she could. She worked extra shifts at the cafe, skipped meals, and borrowed from friends. Ethan pocketed the money, always promising it was the last payment, but it never ended. When her savings ran out, he became crueler. He mocked her accent, her food, her ambitions. He called her naive for believing that hard work could change anything. He stopped pretending to be her husband in public, telling people she was just a tenant. Ananya wanted to leave, but she couldn't. Her documents, passport, and immigration letters were all locked in a drawer he kept in his room. She didn't even know where he had moved her marriage file. One evening, when Ethan was out, she searched the apartment hoping to find her papers. Instead, she discovered something else: photographs of other women, copies of marriage certificates, and several fake identification cards. There were at least 4 different names written in Ethan's handwriting, all paired with the same photo of him. Her hands trembled as she realized he had done this before. She wasn't the first victim. It became clear that Ethan ran a quiet but profitable scam. He targeted vulnerable international students, mostly women desperate for legal status. He offered marriage in exchange for money, promised safety, and once he had control over them, he drained them financially and emotionally. When they couldn't pay anymore, he abandoned them and found new victims. Ananya had unknowingly walked straight into his trap. The discovery filled her with disgust and shame. She thought about going to the police, but fear held her back. If she reported him, she would have to admit to being part of a fraudulent marriage. The authorities could deport her immediately. Ethan knew that, and he used it to keep her silent. The more she tried to resist, the more ruthless he became. Months passed in suffocating routine. She woke up early, went to work, came home, and endured Ethan's constant taunts. Every day felt heavier than the last. She could feel herself breaking. But then, one night, while checking Ethan's phone for any trace of her missing documents, she found a message that changed everything. It was from a woman named Madison Clark. The text read, "Can't wait to finally start our life together." Attached was a picture of a diamond ring. Ananya stared at the screen, frozen. Ethan wasn't just scamming students anymore. He was engaged to someone else. Madison's profile showed she was a nurse from Toronto, older than Ananya, confident and well-off. The realization cut deeper than any insult he had thrown at her. All those months, while she struggled to survive, Ethan had been planning a new life with another woman. The man who had stolen her money, her dignity, and her dreams was about to marry someone else and leave her behind like she never existed. That night, as she sat alone in the dark apartment, something inside her shifted. She no longer felt fear, only a cold, quiet rage. She knew she couldn't go to the police, couldn't return home, and couldn't keep living as his pawn. If Ethan had used marriage to trap her, she would use the same bond to destroy him. What began as a desperate attempt to stay in Canada was about to turn into something far more dangerous. For the first time in months, Ananya stopped crying. She had a plan forming in her mind, one that would take everything from the man who had taken everything from her. And she would make sure his fall was slow, painful, and unforgettable. Ananya's anger hardened into a kind of focus she had never known. Where fear had once dissolved her, method replaced it. She stopped crying and started cataloging. Every insult, every demand for money, every lie became a thread she could pull. She needed proof that would survive scrutiny, documents, recordings, bank transfers, pictures. Proof would be power, and power was her only path out of the smothering life Ethan had built around her. She began by learning how Ethan operated. He kept meticulous notes, names, dates, amounts, in a battered notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He used the same courier service to move forged documents between clients. He photographed victims' passports and stored the images on an old laptop he rarely locked. Ethan believed he had covered his tracks, but his confidence made him sloppy. Ananya watched and waited for those slips. Each small error was a door she could open. Ananya reached out to someone she had met in class, a quiet but determined student named Julian Patel. Julian had arrived from Gujarat with a scholarship and a thin smile that masked deep worry. He had once confided without flourish that he had been approached by a man offering the same help Ethan had given Ananya. He had paid and been abandoned. He still owed money to a lender and was desperate. That desperation meant he was willing to help her, but it also meant he had his own reasons for getting even. Together, they mapped a plan that relied on patience more than violence. They would create an appearance of cooperation to lure Ethan into revealing his network. Ananya would act the part of the grateful wife again, the woman who had forgiven and wanted to work with him. Julian would pose as a new client, an immigrant with cash and nowhere to turn. They rented a small office in Brampton under a fabricated business name and set it up to look legitimate. A desk, a receptionist's chair, a stack of fake business cards. The space was a stage where Ethan could be both performer and victim. Ananya invested in simple surveillance, a compact camera tucked above a bookshelf, a second motion sensor behind the reception plant, and a phone with call, recording apps she kept hidden. She learned to use burner phones, to create throwaway email accounts, and to mask her internet tracing. Every meeting, every phone call, every cash exchange she captured. She recorded Ethan promising fast solutions, recorded his insistence on cash, only deals, recorded him coaching other victims on how to lie to border officers. Listening back to those files was like peeling off a layer of skin, painful but clarifying. As weeks passed, the office began to fill with the sort of people Ethan preyed on. Hopeful faces, wallets folded tightly, trembling hands offering bank transfers. Ethan arrived proud and confident, telling stories of success, of how he helped people. He introduced Ananya to prospective clients as the business partner who handled paperwork. The irony felt like ice in her mouth. He boasted about contacts at immigration. He spoke of contacts that did not exist. Each boast added to the mountain of evidence she was building. Julian proved his worth beyond loyalty. He tracked money flows through a series of small transfers and managed to intercept a receipt Ethan had forgotten to tear up. He learned to shadow Ethan's meetings, to follow him to the garage where forged documents were printed, and to memorize license plates that could be traced later. His anger matched Ananya's, but beneath it was a calculating mind that turned their anger into logistics. There were moments when Ananya felt the old panic rise, a hand on a doorknob, a late night phone call that made the hairs on her neck stand up. She trained herself to breathe through those spikes, to let the nerves sharpen her attention rather than scatter it. She became meticulous about small details, wiping down surfaces, planting false leads, erasing metadata from photos she intended to keep private. She learned the only language that could save her, carefulness. One night, while sifting through Ethan's discarded receipts, Ananya found something that changed the stakes. Tucked inside a cigarette pack was a short list of names, more than the handful of students she'd assumed. The list included not only students, but at least one accountant and a woman with a public-facing job. This meant Ethan's scheme reached beyond desperate youths. It was a broader, bolder enterprise. Exposure could bring ruin not only to him, but to a network that could retaliate. That realization tightened the plan. Exposure would hurt many, and the police could be slow or compromised. Ananya decided she would not merely collect evidence to hand to strangers. She wanted a confrontation that stripped Ethan of the control he had wielded, a moment when he would understand the depth of what he had done. The plan they'd made in whispers and careful gestures moved from documentary to decisive. The stage was set, the props in place, and the two conspirators were ready to turn proof into consequence. The night that would change everything arrived with quiet precision. Spring had just begun to thaw the icy streets of Mississauga, but inside Ethan's apartment, the air was heavy with tension. For days, Ananya had rehearsed every step in her mind, how she would speak, what she would bring, and when she would act. She had already deleted messages, cleared her phone logs, and left a false trail of activity that suggested she was far from the city. It wasn't anger that guided her now, it was an eerie calm, a certainty that what she was about to do couldn't be undone and didn't need to be. Ethan had called her earlier that day, his tone unusually pleasant. He told her he wanted to celebrate their success from the immigration business. He sounded almost affectionate, as if the last 2 years of control and humiliation had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Ananya knew better. She suspected that Ethan had begun to sense her distance, that he might be planning to discard her soon. This dinner was not a celebration, it was a test. Before leaving her apartment, she packed carefully. A bottle of red wine, laced with a sleeping pill powder she had purchased weeks earlier, a pair of gloves, and a small drive containing all the recordings and documents she had gathered. The plan was simple in her mind. He would drink, he would sleep, and she would make it look like an accident, a fall, a careless night of drinking alone. She had studied enough true crime documentaries to know what mistakes to avoid. She wouldn't let emotion cloud her timing. When she arrived, Ethan was already half drunk, lounging on the couch in his usual stained shirt. He greeted her with mock warmth, telling her she looked better than usual. She smiled faintly, placing the wine bottle on the table. He didn't notice her gloved hands. They talked for a while, mostly him talking about his supposed future plans with Madison Clark, his wealthy fiancée who still didn't know about Ananya. Every word scraped against her nerves, but she held her composure. When she poured the wine, he didn't hesitate. He drank greedily, pouring himself another glass before she even finished hers. Within minutes, his speech began to slur. He laughed at his own jokes, stumbled to the kitchen, then collapsed back onto the couch, mumbling incoherently. Ananya waited, her pulse steady. She needed him to lose consciousness completely. Her plan was to stage the scene, spill some alcohol, loosen his belt, and let him choke on his own intoxication. No one would question it. But things rarely go according to plan. As she moved closer to check his pulse, his eyes fluttered open. He saw her hovering over him with the half-empty bottle, and confusion turned to rage. He grabbed her wrist, snarling something she couldn't understand. The struggle began instantly, loud, messy, desperate. He swung at her, knocking her to the ground. The bottle shattered and glass scattered across the carpet. She tried to push him away, but his strength overpowered hers. In the chaos, she reached for the nearest object, the metal lamp beside the couch. Without thinking, she swung once, twice. The sound was sickeningly dull. Ethan fell sideways, his body twitching before going still. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at him, the lamp still clutched in her trembling hands. There was blood on the floor, on her gloves, on the wine bottle shards, glistening like red glass. For a long moment she couldn't move. Then, methodically, she began to clean. She wiped surfaces, gathered the broken pieces, and burned paper evidence in the kitchen sink. She placed his phone beside his body, sending a message to Madison from his account, a message about needing space and being mentally exhausted. It would buy her time. She left the apartment just before dawn, walking through the empty streets as if in a trance. The sun was rising, pale and cold, painting the sky with streaks of pink. To anyone watching, she looked like another student heading to work. No one would guess what she had left behind. By the next evening, Ethan's body was found. The police believed it was an accident, a fall after heavy drinking. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious motive. Ananya watched the news quietly, her face calm, her eyes distant. She had done what she believed was necessary. For the first time in years, she felt free. But she didn't realize that the seeds of her downfall had already been planted. In every file she had saved, every message she thought she had deleted, and one small mistake she hadn't noticed, the faint smear of her fingerprint on the inside of the wine bottle. For weeks after Ethan's death, Ananya lived in a state of quiet relief. The world outside her window felt lighter, as if the weight that had been crushing her for years had finally lifted. The news reported Ethan's death as an accident, a tragic case of a man who had drunk too much and fallen during the night. His fiancée, Madison Clark, was interviewed briefly, crying on television about how she had just spoken to him hours before. The police found no evidence of foul play, and the case was closed within days. Ananya watched that news clip on repeat, her expression unreadable. To her, it was justice disguised as coincidence. She went back to her studies, resumed her shifts at the cafe, and even began to socialize with classmates again. No one suspected anything. To them, she was just another hardworking student. But inside, she was different. The part of her that used to tremble with fear was gone. She had done something irreversible, something that made her both powerful and permanently changed. For the first time, she felt in control of her own story. Julian, her quiet accomplice, remained distant after the incident. He suspected what she had done, though she never confessed it directly. Their plan had been about exposing Ethan, not ending him. When he saw Ethan's death on the news, he confronted her gently, asking if she had gone too far. Ananya denied it with a calm so chilling that Julian never asked again. He deleted their shared files, moved out of Brampton, and tried to disappear from her life. But even he couldn't shake the unease that something about Ethan's death would not stay buried. Months turned into a year. Ananya graduated with honors and applied for a new visa under her permanent residency application, citing her late husband's support. The irony of using Ethan's name to stay in Canada wasn't lost on her. She even found a small apartment in downtown Toronto where no one knew her past. From the outside, it looked like she had rebuilt her life, a model immigrant student turned successful young professional. But guilt has a strange way of finding cracks in even the strongest facade. At night, she started having dreams. In them, Ethan wasn't dead. He stood in the corner of her room, whispering the same words he used to say when she defied him. "You need me?" She would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. Every sound, a knock on the door, the buzz of her phone, made her jump. She told herself it was just stress, but the paranoia grew stronger. One evening, scrolling through her phone, she stumbled upon a Reddit forum for victims of immigration scams. Dozens of posts detailed stories eerily similar to hers. The more she read, the angrier she became at how many people like Ethan were still out there. Without realizing it, she created an anonymous account and began to write her own story. Not all of it, just enough to hint at what she had done. She wrote, "Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law. Sometimes you have to make it yourself. E.W. finally got what he deserved." It felt satisfying in the moment, like a confession without consequences. But the internet never forgets. A week later, a moderator of the forum flagged her post, reporting it for possible involvement in a criminal act. Investigators traced the IP address back to her apartment. They obtained a warrant to search her devices. On her laptop, they found fragments of deleted files, voice recordings, hidden folders, and cached images from the days she had been collecting evidence. Among them was a video clip showing Ethan's reflection in the office camera, arguing with her just weeks before his death. It was enough to reopen the case. When the police arrived, Ananya didn't resist. She sat quietly as they searched her apartment, her face pale but calm. At the station, they presented the evidence, her fingerprints on the wine bottle, the deleted recordings, and the Reddit post. Each piece of proof was like a thread unraveling the illusion of her perfect freedom. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even try to explain. She simply said, "He ruined lives. I stopped him." The trial drew public attention, especially among immigrant communities. To some, she was a cold, cold-blooded killer who had planned her husband's death. To others, she was a victim of manipulation who had been pushed too far. The courtroom was divided between condemnation and sympathy. In the end, the law saw only one truth: she had taken a life. Ananya Deshmukh was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years. When asked if she regretted it, she said softly, "Regret doesn't change anything. He's gone, and so am I." Years later, her story continued to circulate online as both a warning and a legend. A young woman who came to Canada seeking a future and found only betrayal, who turned survival into revenge and revenge into ruin. Some say she still writes letters from prison to help other victims of marriage scams. Others say she refuses to speak of it ever again. But one thing remains certain: her perfect revenge had come full circle, ending exactly as it began, in desperation, deceit, and the high cost of freedom.